Welcome to the Ash Cloud. I'm Ash Sweeting. Today we are joined by Frank Mitloehner from the UC Davis Clear Centre. Frank has been researching the intersection of animal agriculture and the environment and leading efforts to communicate these complex interactions between environmental health, human health, our food systems and the role of livestock. Frank's work on methane emissions has created the most headlines, both praising his leadership and research in working to mitigate the climate impact of cattle, and admonishing him for supporting livestock production. On this note, I wanted to hear Frank's perspective on how the conversation around methane has evolved, including the increasingly passionate positions on the role of ruminants in our food systems that are being advocated by different groups focused on addressing climate change. Frank, thank you very much for joining me today.
Well, thanks for having me, Ash.
So you've been working in methane emissions and the environmental and climate impact of livestock production for 20 odd years. And how has the conversation changed in that time and evolved? And when you were first starting off in this space, what were the challenges in trying to even get the importance of methane onto the agenda?
Well, that depends on which group we are talking about, the public at large or the farming community or the environmental groups, the agencies. All of them had very different attitudes toward the topic, very different backgrounds, and so forth. So, but I would say to the farming community, methane and greenhouse gases in general, they viewed this as a threat. And they viewed this as something that is not real and something that we should nip in the bud as a non-topic. That's what it was like originally. They have come a long way. This is, I would say, a viewpoint only shared by a few today. The vast majority of farming associations understand how important the topic is and that it needs to be addressed and that they are part of this picture. Activist groups have, over the years, viewed methane and greenhouse gases as the Achilles heel of animal agriculture, a topic that needs to be milked, so to say, to get animal agriculture out of business. And agencies were pretty much told, look, in the past you have dealt with volatile organic compounds and with particles and with ammonia, but now you need to very quickly and very thoroughly address greenhouse gases, and particularly methane. And the public at large is confused, still confused. They hear about the climate killer cow, and they're wondering what's real and what's not real. The one party says this is all a bunch of baloney. They're talking about cow farts. The other one says, no, this is absolutely important. We need to address that urgently. And the public is left wondering what's real, what's not. Scientists like myself are always in between. We are in between the different lines. We do research on this topic. We quantify a gas like methane from dairy, beef, and other sources. We find ways to mitigate methane. And when you're in the early stages of doing it, you just allow yourself some flexibility, and you really just want to know what works. What works? What are the general pathways that one can follow? It's not so much about practicality at the beginning when you start this. It's also not so much about what will it cost. These issues, they become issues later. At first, you just want to know what works. And then when you publish that, some people will say, oh, look at that. University people come up with these great ideas and they are cost prohibitive. Well, that's not really fair, because just imagine you have to develop a COVID vaccine. The first drug developments were extraordinarily expensive. Now they are so much cheaper. The same thing is true on methane. Okay, so we have come a long way understanding what works, and now we are fine-tuning it. So I'm sorry, it's a very long answer to a seemingly easy question, but it's not an easy question because it's multifaceted.
Well, I think it's a wonderful to explore the complexities in all that, because it's not simple in any way, shape, or form, and pretending it is, or trying to come up with simple solutions or simplistic solutions to such a complex issue is literally burying your head in the sand. You
Mhm.
mentioned that initially the farming community saw methane as a threat, and then over recent years they have largely come on board that it's an issue that needs to be addressed. Can you share with us, in terms of that whole, communicating that message, nurturing the farmer, working with the farmers, what do you think has been successful in terms of building that consensus, and what do you think has been unsuccessful in terms of how that message has been put out there?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say there's consensus, okay? You never find consensus, but there is large agreement, I would say, that methane is a different beast compared to other environmental pollutants, such as nitrates or ammonia or other gases and compounds. Why is it different? Because methane, in contrast to the other greenhouse gases, is very short-lived. It's not just produced by sources such as cows or rice paddies or landfills, but it's also naturally destroyed and has a short lifespan as a result. And what that means is that if you have a constant methane source, let's say a constant cattle herd in a given locality, and that source remains constant for decades, then an approximate equal amount of methane that's produced is also naturally destroyed. That means a near constant source of methane does not add additional warming to our planet. Now, some farmers say, you see, Mitloehner says methane is not a problem. That's not true, and I'm not saying that. I'm just saying when methane is a constant source, then you're not adding additional warming. Additional warming you add when you increase methane over time. So let's say your family always had 100 cows. Since 1980, your family had 100 cows. And you're continuing to have 100 cows. You're not planning to increase your herd size. And that means that the methane put out by these cows that was produced in 1980 was gone in 1990, but replaced with new methane from those new cows in 1990. But the methane from 1980 was gone by 1990. So what I'm telling you is that you have a constant destruction of this gas if you hold your herd size stable, so stays the warming related to it. Now, if you increase methane from the 100 cows, let's say you grow to 200 cows, then you increase methane by a lot. And yes, methane is a potent greenhouse gas, almost 30 times more potent in trapping heat from the sun than CO2 is. So that would cause additional warming if you increase methane over time. If you, however, and this is the really important point, if you, however, understand the significance of methane and the nature of methane, and you learn to mitigate it, then you replenish less methane than is naturally destroyed. And that means the concentrations are now going down, and that means the related warming is going down. So if we learn ways to reduce methane by 20, 30, 40% over 20, 30 years, then we are net reducing warming. And that makes our farmers part of a climate solution. And for those people who think this is greenwashing, I have news, it's not greenwashing, it's chemistry and physics mixed with a good portion of engineering that makes that happen. And I don't think there's a lot of discussion over what I just said to be true. But what it means in reality and what it means to our farmers is by taking that bull by the horns, so to say, and mitigating this gas, you can reduce warming and become part of a climate solution. And that resonated with farmers.
So I would completely agree that, especially amongst the scientific community, there's very little doubt, both on the environmental side and the agricultural side, with the science that you just shared with us. So thank you very much for that. And I guess it comes back to that communication side of things, and if I understand what you said correctly, if you're talking to them the farmers or to people about being part of a solution rather than being part of a problem, it's a lot easier to bring them on board and get enthusiasm and buy-in rather than telling them they're the problem, which is likely to get their back up and they're going to resist that.
That's right. That's the way it is. I mean, you can be a traffic member, let's say, who is a problem if you don't live up to the rules and regulations. But you can also be a traffic member in your car that is absolutely not a problem. That's abiding by the laws and is courteous with its fellow drivers. The same is true for farming. Okay, you can, if you ignore issues such as the one we are discussing here, putting out methane, then you are part of a problem. If you take it seriously and you actually reduce that gas, then you can become part of the solution. Yes.
You mentioned earlier the COVID vaccine development as an example, and that's a wonderful example of what the global scientific community can do if there's consensus globally and there's investment into actually let's solve the problem. And when you actually look at the amount of money that's invested in methane mitigation across the climate space, it's less than 5%. It's a very, very small fraction. And sorry, this is a little bit complex because I'm going to link in the fact that the general public is a little confused, and having that general public, that body of energy or buy-in from the general public will help drive funding in the direction of methane mitigation solutions. So where do you see that nexus, getting that funding so that you can look at that, a bigger approach, not like COVID, but we can see what we can do if we put those resources there, and what we need to build that consensus? Because even environmentalists, whether they're anti-cow or pro-cow, most people see methane as this emergency brake. If we want to limit methane in the short term or in the immediate term, limit warming in the short term and the immediate term, there's very little dissent that methane is one of our greatest opportunities. So getting that consensus together, where do you see the challenges and opportunities in doing that?
Well, to get consensus is not realistic. You will not get consensus, but you get majorities. I think the majority of people understands animal source foods will be in high demand in the years to come. They will not go away. And if we want to minimize the impact of animal source foods on the environment, let's say on climate, then we have to work with farmers because that's where the emissions occur and that's where we can get the greatest bang for the buck. The problem is funding for research in this area is dismal. It's absolutely dismal. The small amount that you cited, by and large, does not go into farming. Okay, so that's just the way it is. And this is not Frank Mitloehner crying for not receiving funding that's needed. This is just me saying you can't expect major research initiatives if there's no money to fuel those initiatives. That's just the way it is. It's expensive work. It's very expensive work, actually. And if society is interested in that work being conducted, then we have to have public funding behind it. And that's very important because people like myself, when we do research, get one question right after that research is published. And that question is, who funded that research? If you say, you name a company funding it, then those outlets will automatically say, oh, look, it was funded by industry, cannot be trusted. And that's ridiculous, okay? Because 2/3 of all research in agriculture in this country, the United States, is funded by private sources, and 1/3 is funded by public sources. But if society is concerned about whether or not you can trust research that's funded by industry, then funding by public must be organized. And that's currently not happening. So that's a problem. That is a problem. I can tell you from my own experience as a scientist, a professor at UC Davis, who made it onto the title page of the New York Times into a one-page article that didn't criticize me for my research being wrong or for me being unethical or anything else, but for the fact that I work with agriculture. And other scientists who saw that article were shocked. Okay, they were shocked that a newspaper like the New York Times would put out a hit piece. Everybody viewed it as a hit piece, and as the reasoning, they said pretty much, you know, he's working with players in the agricultural sector, and that brings the validity of what he says into question. To me, that's alarming, because I think that the is depicted in ways that the farming sector doesn't deserve. It's as important, in my opinion, the farming sector producing food, as the health sector providing health for our population. And what I mean by that is both the health and the farming sector require significant public investment and people to continue working with it. Efforts like the one by the New York Times affect exactly the opposite. That scientists like myself say, you know what, I don't need this. You know, I don't need this. I don't want to be part of that.
I'm likely to open a can of worms with what I'm about to say, so I apologize in advance for that. But when you look at methane emissions globally, something like 70% of them come from non-OECD countries. And back to what you said about research that's funded, whether it's by private or by government, you know, there will be trickles down into all those other countries from research developed in those OECD countries, whether it's the EU, whether it's the United States, or whether it's Australia. So there's additional benefits there. But then, given the fact that 70% of emissions come from non-OECD countries, and if you look at, and I'm not necessarily against innovation in food production and fermentation to grow new proteins and all that sort of stuff per se, but as a climate solution, having a technology that's applicable only to the top 10% most wealthy people on the planet, I don't see that as being particularly, you know, there's the other 90% which we can't ignore, and that's monumental. But there's this huge disparity in funding, literally multiple orders of magnitude.
Yes.
And I guess what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So first of all, it's not a question of do we do this or do we do that? You know, do we do research in developing countries or in developed countries? The answer is we have to do it here and there, because while our emissions from the livestock sector are dwarfed in comparison to those in developing countries, doesn't mean that our farmers are off the hook. And it doesn't mean that we can lean back and say, look, it's much worse elsewhere, and therefore let's not do it. We have to do our bit, and we do it. But you are right. The number that you quoted, 70%, is a low ball. The IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, estimates that 80% of global livestock emissions are associated with production in developing countries. So this is not finger pointing or so at all. But what it is stating that these very large livestock herds that exist in countries like, let's say, India, have a phenomenal environmental footprint. And I mean phenomenally high environmental footprint. Why? Because it takes 10 to 20 cows there to produce the same amount of one cow a year. And that's just a fact. A country like China, that's really not obviously a real developing country, but it's a pretty developed country. But on the agricultural side, it's still a developing country, is home to half of the world's pigs. Half of the world's pigs live and are produced in China. They produce an enormous amount of pigs, but every year they have 40% of their pork crop, 40%, die pre-weaning. 40%, that's 400 million pigs that die pre-weaning in China because of health issues, nutrition issues, and other things. Now imagine the resources that go into the production of 400,000 pigs that never make it to the market. And this is China. It is much worse in African countries and so on. So you are spot on in saying we need to get our act together and work with those partner countries in developing countries or in the developing world in order to help them. First, improve the veterinary system. Second, improve the nutrition of those animals. Third, produce better genetics that's more efficient. We also have to produce better reproductive results. All of these tools are very, very important. In developing countries, hardly anybody talks about methane or about ammonia. They talk about efficiencies. And efficiencies are directly related to environmental impacts. The more efficient the animals become, the relatively smaller the herds and the smaller the footprint of the industry.
The very positive thing about everything you just said is that we know we have the science, we have the knowledge to do those things. They're paths that have the developed world have, worked on over the last 100 or 200 years or however long that's taken to improve the efficiency and the genetics and everything. So it's not a technical challenge to do that. It's a social or cultural or financial challenge to do that. Do you, and when the conversations I've had when we're within the agricultural research science space, there's collaboration between researchers across those areas. So where do you see the gaps in terms of actually realizing the potential to make those changes in those developing countries? Because I've been very privileged to have worked across Africa and in South Asia and in many parts of the developing world, and you see the living conditions, and they're certainly not as luxurious as they are here in California. So there's huge food security benefits and economic benefits in, as well as the environmental benefits that come with that. So where do you see the opportunities to have impact there?
I see opportunities everywhere. I see huge opportunities in making better use of natural resources. I see huge opportunities in reducing wastes. Let's say in agriculture and food production in developing countries, 40% of all food produced there gets lost. Food losses and food waste in both developing and developed countries are horrendous, approximately 40% in each respective part of the world. 40%, 40. Now, these losses can be drastically reduced. Technologies that we know work here don't always work in developing countries, but they can be adapted in many ways. For example, a targeted breeding of heat tolerant breeds. Okay, certain breeds that we have here will not work there because it's just simply too hot or too humid or too parasite prone and so on. So there are enormous opportunities, but there are real limitations. A huge limitation is funding. There's just not the money out there for colleagues in those countries to do the work. Most people in this country here and in European countries don't work in these developing countries, except for people like Joe McFadden, who for quite some time now has been working in India, which is very laudable. But most people won't do that. So that's one issue, lack of funding, lack of support, lack of research infrastructure, or lack of scientists. Another significant issue can be cultural or religious. Just think of India and the status bovines have in India. If a cow is holy, well, then there's only so much you can do in order to manipulate her in some ways to be more productive or really come to a different solution with respect to what happens to her when she's no longer productive, when she runs out of milk production. What happens to her? Right now, she just walks around freely, and that can be a decade or so before she falls over dead. Now, that's coupled with a huge environmental footprint, but how do you address that if religion, if culture, and so on murky the waters there?
No, the cultural and religious aspects are a key a key issue, and I think that's, yeah, every place is different. When you look at some of the pastoral communities, also in South Asia, but also in Africa,
Mhm.
the prestige is about the number of animals you have, not how productive they are. So frequently, you
Right.
have these very large herds of very skinny, unproductive animals, but their environmental footprint is much higher than if you had, and their food production is much lower than the way it could be if we manage them in a more focused way, on specifically on food production and emissions. So that's a huge challenge. Um, and from my experience, I say that there's nothing that substitutes actually, spending time amongst communities to actually understand how they work, and how they think, and where their priorities lie.
Yep, I agree.
So in terms of the research that you're involved in now, where can you tell us what the most exciting aspects of that are? What's kind of you see as the most promising or the most exciting, and how that's all going?
So we are doing mainly research on emission mitigation of greenhouse gases and other criteria pollutants affecting air quality. And here we work on nutritional strategies, we work on breeding strategies, we work on manure strategies to reduce emissions from beef, dairy, swine, in the future also poultry. We have pretty unique facilities here at UC Davis that allow us to do that kind of work. Um, I see a very significant demand for this line of research. I'm also happy about having been able to receive public support, funding support in particular, to do some of that research. Um, so I think right now I'm pretty upbeat about the work we do, and I see real world needs. I'm also very happy about the impact we have, because the research we do is not just making its way into a peer-reviewed paper, a peer-reviewed journal, but we are communicating that research in ways the target audiences can understand. And that sounds like a trivial thing to say, but it's not. Most scientists I meet are very good at doing the research they do, but they suck at communicating it. And I know you know what I'm talking about. It's very difficult to have a normal conversation with most professors and other scientists that are of a kind where it's really clear what they're saying and what that means to the real farmer and so on. And we are not like that. I have a center, the CLEAR Center, that I'm directing, and the hallmark of the CLEAR Center is both research and communications. And the communications occurs with farmers, but it also centers around other stakeholders, such as agency staff or policymakers or journalists or high school students or college students. So we target our communication to those target audiences we seek to reach, and we make sure that people really get it. Okay, that it's not our intent to get everything as technically correct as possible. Of course, it has to be technically correct, but it doesn't have to be super precise for all audiences, but it has to be very understandable and relatable. And that is where really our hallmark lies. And that's why particularly the farmers are very fond of us, because what we say makes sense to them. They understand what we are saying. And I don't want to be misunderstood as saying farmers are dumb. They're not at all dumb. They're very intelligent, but they are trained in other fields. And if you now go and talk to a farmer about some molecule and what that molecule does to another molecule, what the half-life is, and what the reactivity is, and all of that, then you will not get anywhere.
No, completely that you have to speak to people in essentially the language that they understand. Uh, it's interesting what you bring up about students and the involvement of schools, and there's been a number of conversations I've had where people have brought up the urban rural divide, and just, the average city kid,
Mhm.
doesn't kind of, it's just like what you said, the farmers don't understand the different molecules, or people who aren't educated in chemistry and science don't necessarily understand half-lives and molecules, and people who haven't spent time amongst animals or on farms or ranches, it's
Mhm.
just an abstract concept. And as our societies evolve and become more urbanized, and that rural urban divide grows, that lack of understanding, or
Mhm.
empathy or ability to empathize grows. How do you see that? And I guess also when you bring in urban students to the farms and you see them interacting with those environments, are there any experiences from that you can share?
Well, I am at the Department of Animal Science here at UC Davis, and we have the largest undergraduate population across all animal science departments in the United States. We have 1,600 undergraduate students. I would say that 90 to 95% of them are from cities, such as Los Angeles and San Francisco and Sacramento and so on. They don't really have much of an idea about food production coming in. When they come to Davis, there's not much background in agriculture and food production, but they are very willing to learn, and they are very eager to learn, and they're most interested in learning where that food that they consume comes from, and all the externalities around it. I teach a class with 400 students in beef, dairy, swine, and sheep, repro, nutrition, and management. And so these are lecture presentations, but then I also teach an associated lab where they go to our 14 animal facilities here on campus at UC Davis, and they get to do hands-on all the practices we do with beef and dairy and sheep and pigs. So most of them want to become veterinarians, and so they do all of that now. Okay, so they vaccinate, and they um, put ear tags in, and they do all the things that we do to livestock in the real world. And then I take them out to commercial farms and ranches so that they actually get to see what it looks like in the real world. So I take them all the way from the classroom to the lab where they do hands-on, all the way to the farm where the farmers then talk to them and clarify all those things they always wanted to know and were never able to ask. And they love it. They absolutely love that experience. It's a very important experience because on social media, they all hear so many things, so much fear mongering and just baloney, I have to say. Just so much baloney out there. And then for them to see the real deal is eye-opening and very telling. They tell me, I cannot believe that I used to have the perception of farmers the kind that I did. And thank God that I've been able to rectify that because I was so wrong.
That's absolutely wonderful that that happens, to share, well, that you shared that story, and that, that's happening with those children or those students, as they're going through their education. Do you think that more broadly that kind of experience should be incorporated further into the education system,
Wow, no
potentially
doubt.
in middle school or high school, just to I guess let one side experience what the other side does?
No doubt. I have a 9-year-old and an 11-year-old, and I continue to be amazed of what they learn in school and what they don't learn in school. What they don't learn in school are many of the things that really matter. For example, how to handle money, how to invest money, how to not lose money, or issues around health. You know, they have no idea what a prostate is. I mean, I don't mean my kids who are still young, but not even in the high school, they know what a prostate cancer is, or what a pancreas is, or what cancer is, or what diabetes is. They don't learn that. Now, and they certainly don't learn anything about food. They have no clue about food. And it is just mind-boggling to me because these topics I just listed, and there are many others, are the ones that really matter in life. Not just because they are pleasing to us, having nice food and well-tasting food and healthy food, but they're essential. And so is a proper way of learning how to deal with money and, of course, dealing with your health and so on. But they're not learning it. To me, this is a real problem that the curriculum our kids have goes into unbelievable detail in so many ways they will never, ever use. But many of the things they will use and need, they will never learn. And that's unacceptable, and certainly unacceptable to see that they don't learn anything about farming and farms and food and the implications of food on our health and on the environment and so on. It absolutely should be part of the curriculum.
I think it shouldn't be forgotten how much influence that children can actually have on their parents as well. And there's two examples I'm going to cite. One's Angus seed stock breeder in Australia, a guy called Harry Lawson, whose children, when they were away at boarding school in Melbourne, when they came back to his farmer's ranch, they were basically telling him about how they were almost being ostracized at school because they were coming from a livestock enterprise and because of the emissions there. And that has led him to be very focused on including that environmental footprint of his production system into his whole genetics program. And the other example I'm going to cite is the Dorr School of Sustainability at Stanford. And John Dorr, the person who funded that whole school, was approached by his daughter one day and basically said, what useful stuff are you going to do with all these billions that you've made? And he then turned around and funded the Dorr School. So, and that's two big examples, but I think even on smaller scale, children will influence their parents often in very positive ways. And that's not the avenue that should be ignored in terms of that whole communication around this topic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I experienced that myself. I've heard stories like that here as well. So yeah.
Before we go, Frank, thank you very much for joining me. But before you go, is there anything else that you would like to add that we haven't already discussed?
Well, I think that it's really time for us as society to understand the incredibly importance of our agricultural sector. Every bite we put in our mouth every day goes there. And the level of criticism that our farmers face is unprecedented. Many of those farmers are near retirement age. That's the average age of our farmers is 59 here in the United States. So they're really close to retirement age. And considering the level of criticism they get, many of them say, you know what, I don't need this anymore. I'm retiring now. Or I certainly don't want my kids to be exposed to that. I see this and hear this all the time. And I'm wondering if people are really clear as to what this does, all this criticism, with respect to the sustainability of our food supply. Who will grow our food in the future, if not the ones who are currently doing it? I just give you a very quick statistics. And that's the statistics for the United States. We have 2 million farmers in this country. That sounds like a reasonably large number, but of those 2 million, 1.5 million, so the great majority, have an annual revenue of less than $25,000, meaning they cannot do farming and live off it. They do it on the side. In the United States today, 80,000 farmers produce 2/3 of all the food we all consume. That's it. Their average age is 59. And I am gravely concerned that that small number will shrink even further, and that the farming sector, as we know it, will just go away, and that we will have issues supporting the population with the food we need. At least food grown in this country by people who were US farmers. So I think we need to change. We need to work with our farmers and not against them. Not just helping them to produce nutritious and tasty food, but also sustainable food. They require support for that because there's no financial margin they have to just build a digester for $1 million or something like that. Because if these things are important for us as society, then we have to help our farming sector adapt, just like we did with our health sector during COVID and other health crises. If we say this is important for society, then society needs to spend money to get it done.
Given the fact, so I'm going to add one more question if that's okay. Given the fact that the importance of our food for, food, without food, we'll all die. It's that black and white. It's that simple. And given the importance of our food systems, both from a health, a well-being, as well as a environmental and climate perspective, we've been very fortunate that we've had very, very cheap food for a long, long time. But is cheap food a luxury that we can't afford, given the fact, or as cheap food as we've had, a luxury that we can't afford, given the importance of having the right farmers who are educated, understand their land, know how to farm and produce safe, nutritious, and sustainable food?
Well, it's a great question. Until very recently, the last number I saw was 6%. The US population paid 6% of their income on food, on average. And we're happy that it's relatively inexpensive, but our farmers are not happy that it's that inexpensive, because what that means is they don't have a margin to live on. And I don't think that we should do that. I think we need to pay for the food the price that it's worth. And that not just means to break even for a farmer, but they have to make a living of it. Being a farmer is being a businessman. Okay, people always think of old MacDonald and the red barn in the background and animals on pasture, and they have these romanticized ideas of what farming should be like. But farming is a business, just like all the other businesses out there. And farmers are businessmen. And if we want them to stay in business, we need to make sure that they have what it takes. And that means a satisfactory income.
Frank, thank you very, very much for joining me today. It's been a pleasure.
It's been a pleasure to me too. Thank you for having me, Ash.
You've been listening to The Ash Cloud with me, Ash Sweeting, in conversation with Frank Mitloehner, recorded in California in September 2024.